General Rupert, greetings. Great to see you in First Western. Thank you for being with us today.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to join you.
I would like to start with new UK Defence Secretary. Grant Shapps replaces Ben Wallace as a Secretary of Defence. How could it influence military support for Ukraine by the UK government?
Well, as you say, Grant Shapps has taken over as the UK's Defence Secretary. Ben Wallace, who's stepped down from politics, has been the UK Defence Secretary for a number of years, and so he offered very good continuity all the way through Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine, or the recent invasion of Ukraine. He has been the Defence Secretary, and so if you like, he's provided the United Kingdom's continuity. You'll recall that Prime Minister Boris Johnson was very supportive of Ukraine from the outset. And Ben Wallace has given good continuity, there is no doubt. But I don't think that his departure will have create any material change for the support the United Kingdom provides to Ukraine. The new Prime Minister, he's not that new anymore, Prime Minister Sunak, is as supportive of Ukraine as Boris Johnson was. So I'm pretty confident that you will see continuing full support from the United Kingdom with the new Defence Secretary.
I would like also to cover situation on the ground. How could you assess current situation on the battlefield in the war in Ukraine?
Yeah, well, you are all much closer to it than me, but observing it, it seems that, as has been the case really from the outset of the war, Ukraine, the Ukrainian military, the Ukrainian nation, the Ukrainian people have done such a fantastic job in resisting Russian aggression, and that continues to be the case. And what I think we've seen through the summer, the offensive that's been going on for a couple of months now is hard. Of course it is. And I have nothing but respect for the leaders and the soldiers on the front line carrying out that offensive. And it's been, in a way, slow going. And there's been commentary about, should it be going faster? Those comments tend to come from people who haven't got great experience of what it's like to conduct an operation like this. And what I think has been fantastic is that Ukraine has kept up the momentum all the time. And what we're seeing is some real progress. There's been progress all the way through the offensive, slow and steady. But in the last week, 2 weeks, particularly in the Zaporizhzhia area, some really positive signs of Ukrainian forces breaking through that critical first line of Russian defenses. So I think there's much to be optimistic about. And I think it's beholden on us in the West to be patient and to understand the real challenges facing the Ukrainian armed forces and the Ukrainian nation in undertaking this offensive.
You mentioned about advances of the Ukrainian army in Zaporizhzhia Oblast. In your opinion, are such advances strategically significant in Zaporizhzhia Oblast and in Donetsk Oblast?
Well, I think they are. If you stare at a map day after day, you can become a bit despondent because the map doesn't change very fast. But that does a disservice to the Ukrainian soldiers on the ground and the Ukrainian leaders who are, as you know very well, they're advancing house to house, hedge line to hedge line, tree to tree, trench to trench. And that never comes to light when you just stare at a map. And so when you look at the map, it doesn't always feel as though the advances are significant and strategic. But they are when you step back from it. Because the strategic question is, who has the initiative in this war? Who is driving the agenda of the war? And that has been, from the very outset, and continues to be, Ukraine. And that's the strategic picture. Would the soldiers on the ground like to see that going faster? Of course they would. But what I think Ukraine does so well is it husbands your precious equipment very carefully, and you show enormous respect and care for the lives of your soldiers, and so you care about casualties in a way that your enemy, Russia, does not. And so, are the current advances significant? Yes, they definitely are. And if the advance around Zaporizhzhia can maintain momentum, it's potentially very significant, because it begins to create the conditions where you can threaten down onto Tokmak, the very significant logistics hub, and then make headway beyond that.
Also, yes, media reports that President Biden could provide Ukraine with ATACMS, long-range missiles, or even with long-range cluster munitions. What do you personally expect from these security packages, and do you think that it could really make a difference, significant make a difference on the ground, significant?
Well, I very much hope that the Americans will make that commitment. And every item of Western hardware, of advanced hardware that is provided to the Ukrainians, makes a difference. Nothing, not one item, not Leopard tanks or F-16 aircraft or ATACMS, no single piece of equipment or ammunition will be decisive. But they add up to something. And so, you've already got the British Storm Shadow missile, and what you want is more weapons that can allow you to strike the Russians at range and increasingly effectively. And so the significance is in the totality, not in the individual item. I amongst many of my fellow commentators, have been frustrated that each major donation has taken a very long time to cross a barrier. So very long discussions about providing tanks, not providing tanks, and eventually tanks are provided. Very long discussions to provide, not to provide F-16s, and then they're provided. And as you know, once that political decision is made to provide a piece of equipment, there's then a long lead time before that equipment is on the front line, having a real impact against Russian forces, because the equipment has to be provided. It's got to come with a sustainment package, and Ukrainian forces are going to be trained on it. It's got to be integrated as part of the Ukraine battle plan. So each time we delay those announcements, it's putting Ukrainian soldiers in jeopardy.
Also, Chief of US Military Intelligence says that there is a realistic opportunity that Ukrainian Army could break remaining Russia's defense lines until the end of the year. Do you support such an assessment?
Well, assessments are only as good as the data that back them up. I'd go back to my observation that the Ukrainian forces clearly have the momentum. The spring offensive hasn't gone as fast as some commentators thought that it might. But, from President Zelensky downwards, all Ukrainian leaders always try to temper the West's expectations about what will be achieved and how quickly. And so do I think it's realistic at the moment to make the sort of headway in the coming months that is being talked about? I do think that's possible. I don't think there's any certainties in war, but I do think the Ukrainian military, they have an effective way of attacking the Russians and of striking them in depth, destroying their logistic supplies, hitting their command and control, and then slowly on the battlefield working way forward. So I think we have plenty of reasons to be optimistic.
Also, yes, General Mark Milley says that Ukraine still has from 30 to 45 days until cold weather sets in, making it more difficult to maneuver on the ground. Do you support such statement, and could cold weather really make it more difficult to maneuver on the battlefield?
Well, first thing to say, I've got the greatest respect for General Milley. and far be it for me to second guess him. I know General Milley from the past, and he's a very fine operational and strategic leader. That said, I'm not a great fan of putting timelines on these things. The rains will come when the rains come. And you as Ukrainians know about, what happens in Ukraine in the east when the rains come better than I do, or any American or British individual. But I think we've got to be cautious of imposing on you, the Ukrainians, our own perceptions of maneuver. So it is undoubtedly true that when you are maneuvering armored vehicles, that gets harder when the rains come and when it gets very muddy, of course. But what you demonstrated last winter is that a classic sort of summer fighting season doesn't need to, when it comes to an end, it doesn't need to stop your offensive operations. Because better than anybody like me, that once you get through the rains and the ground freezes, that is good for maneuver. And also, because your troops are often maneuvering on foot, yes, of course, that it's hard going for the soldiers. It's brutal, but your soldiers are tough fighters, and this is their country. It's their, they're used to those weather conditions. And so I don't buy the theory that says that those soldiers can't keep pressing forward through the minefields, taking houses, taking tree lines, just because the rains come. So I don't know, but if I was a betting man, I would imagine Ukrainian armed forces will keep up the pressure no matter when the rains come.
Let's cover also recently Russia's attack on Romania. Russia attacked Romania with long-range drones. How could you assess NATO's response towards this incident?
Well, this is the second time that elements of Russian munitions have fallen into neighboring countries. You'll recall some months back, Poland, some weaponry fell into Poland. I think we have to be really careful when these things happen. It's not in anybody's interest for the war to escalate geographically or in scope. And so I think NATO is very careful with how it deals with these incidents, rightly so. Ukraine, I think, is very right to highlight when this happens. But I think we've got to be careful of concluding this is a deliberate attack on Romania. It is an attack. It's an illegal attack on Ukraine, undoubtedly. And there's been some fallout across the border into Romania, as in the past there has been into Poland. And I think NATO must and has messaged Russia in the strongest possible terms about not expanding the conflict into attacks onto NATO nations and nation soils. But I think we've just got to be really careful in our language when these sort of incidents happened to understand whether or not they are deliberate or whether they are just, collateral across a border, which is what I assess these incidents to have been.
But don't you think that a lack of strong response from NATO just allows Russia and allows Putin to continue to attack border regions of NATO's eastern flank?
Well, I don't think NATO's kind of letting these things pass. It is not in Kyiv's interest for the war to escalate. NATO, I think, has tried to give Ukraine the very best support it can over the last 18 months. I think they've been very careful not to inadvertently escalate the war, as I've already described. For my money, since late last year, for about a year now, it was clear that Russia weren't going to go to nuclear weapons, we think. And that was, I suspect, always the kind of concern amongst at NATO level about providing too much support to Ukraine, and that's been the reason why there's been delays in providing tanks and F-16 jets and long-range munitions, was because of that concern. But again, I think NATO will still be very, very careful about doing anything that might broaden the scope of the war. That isn't in NATO's interest. I also don't believe that's in Ukraine's interest.
Also, the Telegraph reports that British spy planes are protecting grain shipments from Ukraine through the Black Sea. Do you think that it could really deter Russia from attacking grain ships in the Black Sea?
Yeah, and so I've got no particular knowledge about those flights, but I think we all understand that the flow of grain out of Ukraine is vital to the global economy. It is vital to African nations and a great many other people, and that President Putin has been using food security as a weapon of war, and that is absolutely unacceptable. And the sooner we get the free and agreed flow of grain back out of Ukraine, the better. And if that needs some kind of deterrence from the air or in some other format to ensure the free flow of trade, then I think that is a good thing. It's got to be very carefully messaged, so there's no misunderstanding. The best thing, of course, would be for there to be an agreement again on the movement of grain out of Ukraine.
Also, Downing Street officially confirmed that they are conducting such flights over the Black Sea. What does it mean? Is it a kind of message or a signal to Russian President Putin?
Well, everything's a message, isn't it? War in a way is about messaging, and what Western nations have sought to do since before the war, but all the way through the war, is to message very clearly to Moscow, to President Putin, about the West's total support for Ukraine, and that support is not time limited, and there's any number of instances where that can be demonstrated. And so the protection of ship movements is, of course, a message to President Putin.
Also, I'd like to cover with you other type of war with Russia, information war. Kremlin continues to spread disinformation and lies about the war in Ukraine. Why it is so important to resist such propaganda, and how could it influence situation on the ground? How could it influence minds of the soldiers on the battlefield?
Well, look, truth is central to war, and Ukraine has right on its side. It has its sovereignty on its side, and so it's vital that Ukraine, indeed the international community supporting Ukraine, maintain the absolute highest standards of integrity at all times. Russia they have a long history of untruths, of lies, of false propaganda. It's in their doctrine. They've always done it, and regrettably, they're extremely good at it. And so they'll just pump out lies on a mass scale. And regrettably, some people will believe those lies. And so it's vital that the Ukraine, and indeed the international community, counters those lies and puts out a sea of truth, if you like. And so it's vital that those lies don't go uncontested. And you asked, what impact can those lies have to the soldiers on the front line? Well, if they go uncontested, they're debilitating from a morale point of view, and so they just have to be contested at every level. And it's one of the things that Ukraine has done brilliantly from the very outset of the war, both at a national level, at a military level, but also your individual members of society on TikTok and all sorts of other social media platforms have been very, very effective at that, putting out the truth. But also one of the things they've done very effectively is mocking the Russians. President Putin and Russians, they do not like to be laughed at, and they don't like to be mocked. And your propaganda campaign at a grand level and at a low level has done that very effectively.
Like also to cover situation in Russia, how could you assess post-coup situation in Russia, and do you believe that Yevgeny Prigozhin is really dead?
Well, I mean, it would appear that Prigozhin is dead. And frankly, he's no loss to humanity. That is not to say, it would appear that A, he's dead, and B, that it was a state-sponsored assassination, and that is clearly, not acceptable. That might have happened. Where does the kind of post-coup, if you call it a coup, leave Russia? Well, firstly, I think nobody particularly relished the idea of Prigozhin taking over in Russia. So a coup is not necessarily a good thing in Russia anyway. But I think to your question, it leaves Putin weakened. Of course it does. His authority was challenged, and the Wagner Group were able to, advance towards Moscow unchallenged. And yes, the whole thing was dealt with, not least with the support of President Lukashenko of Belarus. But it points to dissatisfaction within Russia. And so I'm not suggesting for a moment that Putin's about to fall, but let's not kid ourselves. This wasn't a good episode for President Putin, and he is weakened as a result of it.
Also, Russian General Surovikin, who was detained after mutiny, has been released. What does it mean?
Well, General Surovikin is, again, a thoroughly unpleasant individual. I served in Syria when he was commanding Russian forces in Syria back in 2017, so I have prior knowledge of him. And he's a very unpleasant operator, but he's pretty effective. It is, he became associated with the coup attempt. It appears, as you say, that he has been released from detention. There's an image of him, seemingly a recent image with his wife. I guess the significance is that it doesn't appear he's about to come back to the front line. The suggestion is that he's been given some kind of air defense responsibility, joint air defense responsibility. But I think critically, he's out of the battle for Ukraine for the time being. It does, of course, point to weakness within the Russian system, that they have all the way through the war been replacing their senior commanders on a very regular basis, and that points to the fact that they're not succeeding. And when militaries are failing, you get a high level of senior turnover.
And my last question for you: what we should expect from the next months of the war in Ukraine, and what we should expect from the next months about the situation in Russia? I mean, political situation in Russia.
So, I think in really high level terms, I would expect the same as we've seen all the way from Ukraine, from President Zelensky all the way through to the citizens of Ukraine and the soldiers of Ukraine. I expect to see nothing but what we've seen all the way through, which is absolute commitment to the defense of your nation, incredibly courageous fighting. And on the battlefield, I think we can hope, not with certainty, but we can hope to see the salient in around Zaporizhzhia growing, and I expect to see that really reinforce over the coming weeks, with Russian reserves being pulled this way and that way to try and stop Ukraine. So big message, more of the same from Ukraine. From Russia, again, frankly, more of the same. You know as well as I do that whilst the Russians may be losing on the battlefield and taking huge amounts of casualties, their ability to absorb losses is very great. That's what their history tells us. But what they can't do is absorb the losses in equipment and ammunition. That's why, that's why they're in talks with North Korea at the moment, because whilst they've got pretty limitless supplies of people, they don't have limitless supplies of equipment. And I suppose the last thing to say, what do I expect to see from the international community in their support of Ukraine is more of the same. And it's vital as we begin transition to the winter that the international community continues to give its uncompromising support to Ukraine in their fight against the illegal invasion.
Thank you, General Rupert, for your time, for your support for Ukraine, and glory to Ukraine.
Thank you very much. I wish you all the best of luck.